why the numbers are greater is partly to do with the wage rates, but our argument would be that if you had this significant increase in investment, it would increase demand to the extent that it might also have some impact on the kind of conditions of work and training in those sectors. Because I totally agree with you about conditions. I mean, I was reading one report whereby they were raising this question about whether care workers were actually doing their work, whether they were spending their 15 minutes in the homes when they should have done. And they said, oh, well, we're thinking about this. We're thinking of tagging the workers. And I just thought, what?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous. And clearly, we would not want to advocate jobs in the sector. But there's a really interesting study that was done years and years ago by an economist called William Beaumont. And he wrote a study in 1967. It was one of the first I read when I was at university. And but he rewrote a book in 2012. And what he points out in there is that the reason why, you see, because what happens is that the costs of care tend to rise relative to other goods because they are so labour intensive. So, you know, if you're making light bulbs, you can really increase productivity, and then the workers can share to some extent in that productivity increase. But because there's no way of increasing productivity in the care sector without changing the nature of what it is you're doing, Beaumont makes an analogy with a string quintet, or a quartet, I always get it wrong, about how you could provide that. How could you increase the productivity of a string quintet? You know? But it wouldn't be the same. It just wouldn't be the same. So what happens is that that when productivity rises elsewhere in the economy, workers get a bit of an increase in wage. And you can't keep workers kind of down there forever, even though care workers are down there for a long way. So they tend to rise a bit. So the costs of caring relative to other types of good tend to increase. And that's why, you know, in general what happens in that kind of case is that it's subsidised, or the public sector take it over, or it goes out of existence. Well, caring can't go out of existence. So in the past it was provided through the public sector. But then because it runs into cost difficulties, it's this argument that the public sector is not efficient. So it goes into the private sector. And then trying to run this industry profitably is incredibly difficult. And that's why the care homes go out of business, because it's really hard to make profit. But the thing is, the reason why their costs are rising is because of productivity increases elsewhere in the economy. So in principle, the resources are there to pay for it. So it's all a question of distribution. And as Diane Elson said earlier, about revaluing work and recognising this. So, you know, there has to be a whole new narrative around, given that in principle we care about our people more than our money, even though we need money.
I thought your presentation was most valuable because, just like Diane's, it's a kind of research for policy. But I just want to tell you one of the examples from India. Of course, the data and care and all is largely here, but we did a trick with the Planning Commission. That is, construction takes the largest portion of our public investment in our plan, because that's the big, now we want to do bridges, we want to do roads, we want to do airports, so construction is a big thing. And we were asking for what you are asking, social infrastructure. And basically toilets and water for women in urban areas. We couldn't get it through. So then we looked up and we found there's a word called soft infrastructure. And so we went to the Planning Commission and said, wherever you build a road, you should put budget for toilet, water and something for the workers. And we got it. So we got a huge, just out of language, an argument. Because if you say it is social investment, you know, from any economics reasoning says social investment is destruction, so you don't do that. But if we do infrastructure itself, which is a big economic thing, and then put this as a percentage of the budget, so we got it in most of the bridges and roads. But what you're saying is also very important, that we can in fact increase employment by putting this in. And we were talking more about how we couldn't get enough budget for providing amenities, social amenities for people. And we would put social amenities as an investment rather than a consumption. So it was a trick, but maybe one could look a little more at these definitions of infrastructure, economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, and sort of do some playing around with the definitions to show that investment in social infrastructure, that is toilets, water, etc., and care, and could in fact add to productivity and employment as you're talking now. Because you have an economic output, which is employment.
Yeah.
But when you use the word of social, and it just becomes consumption.
Okay.
And so I found it very interesting what you did.
We've got two questions. We'll take them both together if we may, from you and from you.
Instead of either construction infrastructure or social infrastructure, one of the tools that was used quite widely and seems to have had some effect in the short term of preventing disaster turning into catastrophe has been quantitative easing. But of course there's a lot of discussion as to whether that could have been done in a better way. And one of the possibilities might have been to have some earmarking of that funding to go into social infrastructure. Have there been any studies about this possibility of what actually happened? And also, it's too early to tell what the long-term consequences of quantitative easing is going to be, but any sense of the future of these different strategies in, say, a 10-year horizon?
Can we just take the second question?
Caroline Sweetman. I thought they were both splendid presentations, and thank you. And I was considering what you were saying, Diane, and considering the question of why it's not considered, and really thinking about what Helena was bringing up about the importance of social norms and constantly needing to push on that if we're going to get any kind of traction. And it seems to me that the care for children and the elderly is a deeply gendered and it's a deeply patriarchal notion that the best care comes from women, from mothers, and for elderly people from daughters. And presumably this is why, ultimately, this will be why this isn't considered, because people just don't hear it. And of course we know that whenever there's a moral outrage around poor care homes and abuse of elders, people's reactions, including all of us, our reactions is we want better care, and then the knee-jerk reaction because of the social norms is, gosh, wouldn't it be better if their families looked after them? And I know from engaging with international development over many years and thinking about paid care work that there are many societies who look at what happens in our society and thinks we're lesser. We're lesser people because we put our old people in homes. And there's so much knotty stuff around there that I was wondering what you thought about what has to happen to actually try to challenge the underlying social norms that might make the influential decision makers who frame these economic policies actually hear what it is we're asking for and not automatically suspect it for its moral implications.
But you have to go back to the cycle in this, because yes, it's true that other countries will say, isn't it terrible that the West is neglectful of the elderly, and that the elderly are not contained within the family. But then you have to say, yes, but who back in the Far East or in the of the elderly in those wonderfully embracing households, and it isn't the men, and so we there has to be a challenge in all of those assumptions too. And one of the reasons why, we as feminists argued for greater opportunities of education and so on for women, and opportunities for women to go into the workforce was to give women independent resource so that they were not forced into decisions and into circumstances where they had no choices, that they couldn't leave abusive men, that they were forced to remain in marriages that were hideous, and all of those things, and that they couldn't live autonomous existences. And so earning your own money is very important about that. I've spent time going to, if you talk to some of the women who are working in factories in places which, where we think it's horribly exploitative, they'll say, yes, but having this money allows me to be able to care for my kids and not have to depend on the man who was giving me a terrible life. And so in amongst all this is quite complex things about about the whole business of how we as human beings have structured our worlds. And so, it's not easy disentangling all of this, and it's not easy challenging even the assumptions that we as women have, men and women have, about how, who does things best and so forth. I think that's one of the problems in all this, and Diane, of course, her work is looking at some of it, but it is about much deeper stuff about our attitudes to how we live together, how we form our societies, and how we do that. And we're really, there's a long way still to go.
Diane, do you want to come?
Well, I could respond to the
Yes, could you want to
quantitative, because it's an interesting
Yes.
discussion that I could perhaps otherwise comment on in the end. I mean, quantitative easing, I'm not a monetary economist, but Robert Skidelsky has done quite a bit thinking about instead of the kind of quantitative easing that happened in this country, by which the banks just sort of used it to to make their capital position somewhat better. So it didn't go anywhere. It was basically lost to the economy. He was suggesting setting up investment banks and so on, but he tends to think of physical investment. He doesn't tend to think of my new word, soft investment or social infrastructure. So I think there is probably some work that other people know more about than I do, but I don't think quantitative easing did any good whatsoever. No, so if you had a public investment bank or even a monitored, regulated, privately funded, it doesn't necessarily have to be in public ownership as long as it's in public control.
Question over there.
Yeah, I'm Barta Kowalska from Poland, from Jagiellonian University. Thank you for both presentations, very inspiring. And I have two questions. The first, very specific about gender budget. I was involved in developing and introducing gender budget data. Influence of gender budgeting consequences. It's the first question, and the second question. So I teach a course entitled Culture, Gender and Society, and usually I have law students, and we have